Hi guys, welcome back to the Home and Homestead. I'm Rebecca, and today we'll be doing some fermenting. We'll be making the classic recipe of sauerkraut. Now we're doing it 4 ways. So we'll be doing a plain as well as 3 different varieties of flavored sauerkraut. This will be a 2-part series. This first part I will be showing you how to prepare and create the sauerkraut and the fermenting process. In part 2, I'll go over how you can store your homemade sauerkraut long term. So let's head to the kitchen and make some homemade sauerkraut. So the first thing that we need to do for making our homemade sauerkraut is prepare our cabbage. So I was able to find 2 huge, beautiful cabbages at the local farmer's market. So what I did is I washed them real well, removed the outer layers of leaves that were a little wilty or if they had little dark spots, and then I cut them in half and then quartered the cabbages and then removed the hard central core, and then I reserved a number of different nice pieces of the outer leaves that we can use later when placing the shredded cabbage into the jars. And then what I did is I weighed the different quarters and I created 4 4-pound portions of the cabbage. So then I will have 4 pounds of shredded cabbage per batch of the 4 different varieties that I'll be making today. And when I weighed the cabbages, I made sure I did that in pounds and grams. And I'll go over with you the 2 different ways that you can measure and figure out the amount of salt that you'll need when making your sauerkraut. So now I have my different portions of my cabbage wedges here, and they all are about 4 pounds each. So now what I'm going to do is cut them into my desired thickness for the shredded cabbage. You can make this as thin or as thick as you like. Somewhere between a 1/4 inch and a 1/16 inch works really nicely. So you can either use a knife or you can use a food processor with a shred attachment, or you could use a mandolin, or the KitchenAid stand mixer has a slice and shredding attachment. Any number of ways that you would like to shred your cabbage, you do that. And once it's shredded to the thickness you'd like, just place it into a bowl. Alright, so we have our first batch of our cabbage all shredded and ready to become sauerkraut. So we have 4 pounds of cabbage that I shredded. And as I said earlier, I measured each batch both in pounds and grams. So if you're following the pounds measurement, then you would do 1 tablespoon of canning salt per 2 pounds of cabbage. If you're following the grams, then you do 2.5% of the weight of the cabbage in grams of canning salt. So these 4 pounds of shredded cabbage ended up being about 1,641 grams, which then ended up being about 41 grams, which ends up being about 2 tablespoons. So it ends up being about the same amount. But I measured it both ways, so you can do whichever you prefer for your measuring. So now we're going to add our canning salt. So we have about 2 tablespoons of canning salt, or about 41.025 grams of canning salt. And you just disperse it throughout your bowl. Since it was all pre-measured, I could have also shredded some, added a little bit of canning salt, shredded some more cabbage, added a little more canning salt, and it'll just be a little bit easier to add the salt to the shredded cabbage, which is how I'll probably do it for the remaining batches, but I wanted to explain how you measure the salt per weight of the shredded cabbage. So now we're just going to take our hands and kind of squeeze and mash and toss around the cabbage with that salt. What the salt's going to do is help this cabbage to release some of its moisture. And the liquid that's created once it's removed from the cabbage becomes the brine. And the cabbage will sit in this brine and ferment. And over time it will become our sauerkraut. So at first I like to just get in with my hands and just kind of stir and mix and squeeze so I know that the salt is nicely incorporated throughout. already starting to glisten a little bit and releasing some moisture. Now your hands work very well for doing this, but you can also use a little wooden masher here and smash down the shredded cabbage. That helps break down some of the cells in the cabbage and helps get that salt into the cabbage so it can release more of the liquid. This little wooden masher came with a fermentation kit that I have. I can provide a link below. It comes with all the nice accessories you need for doing your fermentation projects. So I'm going to keep mashing and smashing this shredded cabbage with the salt. And we'll come back for the next step when it's ready to go into the jars for fermentation. Alright, so I've been mashing and smashing and preparing the sauerkraut here. I was squeezing and mashing for about 15 minutes and I let it sit for about a half hour. I'll give you a closer look here. There's a nice amount of liquid on the bottom. And the sauerkraut, the cabbage, is nice and shiny and glistening, and it's definitely compacted quite a bit more. So now our shredded cabbage with the salt is ready to go into some jars to be fermented. So I have two styles of jars. I have a clamp top type jar that has a silicone seal to make a nice tight seal, and then I have a quart wide mouth canning jar. So what I'm going to do is just take a few handfuls of the prepared shredded cabbage and place it into each of the jars. I have a rimmed sheet pan here which helps to contain some of the mess that we'll make. But it's good to have this underneath as well when we are fermenting. That'll help collect any liquid that might bubble out during fermentation or when we're burping the clamp top lid during the process. Now I'm going to take our little wooden packer here, or tamper, mash it nice and tight down into the jar. Do this for both. Now we'll add some more. We'll just keep adding a few handfuls at a time and tamp and pack it down into the jar until it's all placed into these jars. If you hear that noise in the background, that's my kitchen helper snoozing and snoring on the job here. As you tamp the shredded cabbage down in the jars, you'll see that brine and that liquid that we created starts to rise up, and you'll see it on the surface. You can hear a little creaking and crackling noise as the liquid is being released from the shredded cabbage. Okay, now we'll just pour the remaining brine in the bowl here right into the jars. There we go. So the shredded cabbage is all nice and tamped down into these jars. And the brine has come up and it is sitting over the top, and all of the shredded cabbage is sitting below some brine that the salt created from releasing the liquid from the shredded cabbage. So now I'll show you how to prepare both of these style vessels for the next step, which is the fermentation. Alright, so we have both style jars here all ready to go. I have a wide mouth mason jar here, and I like to label the jars so I know what flavor I'm doing. So I have a plain label for both. And what's really great about homemade sauerkraut is this is the base recipe for the classic plain sauerkraut. But you can add numerous different flavors, and I'll go over 3 really tasty varieties with you today, and you can make your sauerkraut really unique and tweak to what your flavor favorites are. So now, as I said earlier, we reserve some pieces of the outer leaves. So we'll just place this on top of our shredded cabbage. That'll just help prevent any little flakes from moving above the brine and try to keep everything nice and submerged. And it's good to fill the jars no higher than the neck of the jar. You want to leave a couple inch head space here because it'll continue to bubble and release liquid, and you want to give your jar enough room for that process to continue to happen. So now we have the leaf down over the surface of our shredded cabbage, and the fermentation complete set I spoke of earlier comes with these glass weights. There's 4 per set. So you just place that on top of your leaf and kind of smush it down a little harder there. Now for the clamp style jar, you just simply close it down and seal it. For a mason jar, the kit comes with these little air locks. They're silicone, and they allow a one-way release of the pressure from the jar as the sauerkraut ferments. The clamp top lid, I will need to open it at least once a week and more or less burp the jar and allow the built up pressure inside of the jar to be released. So now we'll set these aside and we'll move on to the next flavor we're making for our homemade sauerkraut. So now let's work on the next flavor variety we're doing for our homemade sauerkraut. So we'll use the same mixing bowl here. Get these shredded into a 1/4 to a 1/16 inch shred, or whatever your preference is. Now we'll add our pre-measured canning salt. Again, it's about 2 tablespoons of canning salt for the amount of cabbage that we have here. And now I'll smush, smash, mash, and toss this shredded cabbage with the canning salt. I'll do this process for about 15 minutes to help release some of this liquid, and then I'll let it sit for about a ½ hour so we can create a nice salty brine. Then I'll share with you what added flavors we'll put with this batch of the sauerkraut. But first, let's get this canning salt incorporated with our shredded cabbage. Let's get our wooden masher or tamper. Alright, now I'll set this aside and let this rest for about a ½ hour. In the meantime, I'll start working on the next 2 varieties so we can move on and add the seasoning to the last 3 batches and get them into jars. Alright, so now we'll move on to the second flavor of our homemade sauerkraut. And that's another classic flavor, which is caraway. So we'll add some caraway seeds. Again, I labeled my jars. So I have a label for caraway on here. And it'll be about 1 teaspoon per 2 pounds of cabbage. but this is completely to taste. So if you wanted a little more caraway seed flavored, add more. If you want a little less, add a little less. We'll just use our hands and mix the caraway seed throughout. Got a nice amount of brine on the bottom. Some liquid started from the shredded cabbage that we mashed and mixed and smashed and then let it sit. Alright, so now let's add the caraway seed flavored sauerkraut to these 2 jars. Again, I'm doing 2 styles of jars to show you the difference in the process. Just a couple handfuls at a time, and use the tamper and the pack and press that shredded cabbage down in the jar. Let's add another couple handfuls. Down. You can see the brine kind of moving to the top here as I pack and smush the shredded cabbage down. Pour the brine in. It's sitting on the bottom of the bowl. And we'll tamp it down again. Alright, now I'll clean up a little bit and we'll add the weights and the lids. Okay, so now we have 2 flavors down and 2 to go. So we have our clean and simple sauerkraut, which is just with the salt, with our shredded cabbage, and then we have another classic flavor of the caraway seeds. This tastes a lot like rye bread and would be really delicious on, say, a Reuben sandwich or something like that. So now let's move on to a third flavor, and we're going to use garlic. So in this bowl, we're going to add 4 to 5 teaspoons of minced garlic for every 2 pounds of cabbage. So let's add our garlic here. And you can certainly add more or less to your taste preference. If you really like garlic, add a little more. If you want to tone it down a little bit, you can certainly add less. We'll add this in here and we'll mix it throughout our shredded cabbage that we've already mashed and smashed and released some of the juices and liquid from the cabbage. Then we can add this prepared garlic flavored homemade sauerkraut mixture to their designated jars. And we'll mash and press and get the shredded cabbage down into these jars, doing a few handfuls at a time and then mashing it further with our wooden masher or tamper until we have all of the shredded garlic flavored cabbage placed into these 2 jars. Now we'll simply wipe off the rims and the sides and the jars and make them nice and clean. Then the mason jars will get their airlock silicone lids followed by a plastic ring. I'll include in the description box below all the equipment that I use for this fermentation project. If you like these plastic rings, they work really well for fermenting. Then we'll place our reserved cabbage leaf over the surface of our shredded cabbage and press that down nicely so that all the shredded cabbage and the leaf is submerged under the brine. And then we'll place the glass weight on top and press that down, and that helps secure everything where it needs to be during the fermentation process. And then the clamp top lid on the other style jar, you simply secure and lock down. So now let's move on to the fourth and final variety of homemade sauerkraut that we're going to prepare today. Alright, for our fourth and final variety, let's do something spicy. So let's use some red pepper flakes. I like to use the crushed red pepper flakes. They have a nice appearance in the sauerkraut, and they actually have kind of a festive look to them. So for this, I'm going to do 2 to 3 teaspoons for every 2 pounds of shredded cabbage. If you like it really spicy, certainly add more. If you don't like it too spicy, maybe skip this variety altogether. This is a fun option to do if you like things a little bit spicy. So let's mix this in through our prepared shredded cabbage. It already was treated with the salt, and I mashed and smashed, and it has a nice amount of juice and brine here. So we're doing the final step of adding our flavoring with our crushed red pepper flakes. So I'll just mix this real well to get it throughout the entire prepared shredded cabbage, and then we'll add this to our 2 types of jars that we'll be using for the fermentation process of our sauerkraut. And the same process holds true. A few handfuls at a time, mash it down, and use your wooden tamper to continue to release more liquid until all of your shredded cabbage is evenly put into your jars, leaving an adequate amount of headspace and room within the jars. Then we'll top with the leaf, the glass weight, and seal as we have with the other varieties. So let me finish this final variety of our homemade sauerkraut today, and then we'll have a look at the different varieties, and we'll move on to the process of fermentation. Alright guys, here you have it. We have 4 different flavors or varieties of homemade sauerkraut that are all prepared and in their designated jars. They'll be ready for fermentation. So we have 2 styles. So we have our clamp top lid and our wide mouth mason jar with the airlock silicone top and a plastic ring. This airlock silicone top here has a little hole in there, so it allows it to breathe and release any pressure that builds up. And I have that on that style jar. And I also have all of them labeled for the different varieties. Now we have a clamp top lid, and these are interesting because these can be used for fermentation as well as storage later in the refrigerator. But I'll go over that in part 2 of this video. So again, for the clamp top lids, they were prepared, and then you just simply secure the lid and they're ready to go. So now I'm going to place all 4 of these varieties onto a rimmed baking sheet and place them in a cool, dark place for fermentation. And this usually takes about between 2 to 4 weeks, depending on how tangy and sour and tart you like your homemade sauerkraut to be. So then I'll check our homemade sauerkraut that's fermenting after a day or 2, just make sure everything looks as it should, and then at about 1 week intervals, I'll release a little pressure out of the clamp top lid jars, and the mason jars have the airlock top, so that'll do that by itself. And we'll go over that process together during the different stages. So I did 4 different varieties. I did plain, which is a nice, clean, simple homemade sauerkraut with just the cabbage and salt flavoring. Then we also did a classic caraway sauerkraut, which will be delicious for Reuben sandwiches and things like that. We did garlic homemade sauerkraut, which is a tasty option to have on top of burgers or even just as a side dish. And then the red pepper homemade sauerkraut is a fun and spicy version that I hope you give a try as well. So now I'll place these in a cool, dark area and allow our homemade sauerkraut to ferment. Alright, so it's been 2 days since we prepared our homemade sauerkraut. I checked them yesterday just to make sure the jars were nicely sealed and everything looked okay, and it did. And now it's starting to form these little bubbles on top, on the surface here, in all of the jars. So for the clamp top lids, what I'm going to do is burp the jars. So I'll just open it Release a little bit of that pressure and close it again. The mason jars to the right, they have the little silicone airlock lid, so that's a one-way valve, and it allows the release of any built-up pressure in those jars. Let me just go and burp each one of these jars. There we go. Now we'll let these sit for another few days. I'll keep coming down and check, and then I'll be able to burp these once a week at that point, and we'll let them continue to ferment until they're nice and tangy and sour. Alright, so now our sauerkraut has been sitting for about 1 week, and we're getting more bubbles, as you can see on the top of the jars here. And the shredded cabbage is also creating more brine, so there's more liquid in here, but there's a nice big area of bubbles on top of our shredded cabbage. So we know that our homemade sauerkraut is fermenting, and it's going to eventually have that nice tangy taste that we're looking for. So for these clamp top lids, I will burp them again. And we'll let them continue to do their thing. So now our homemade sauerkraut has been sitting for about 2 weeks. So I'm going to burp these jars if they need it anymore. It's more of just checking them over, making sure everything looks okay. You definitely smell a little bit more of that sauerkraut scent, and the cabbage is starting to get a little more of a translucent appearance to it. There's still bubbles along the top, and the weights have all of the sauerkraut and shredded cabbage submerged in the brine. So we're going to let these sit for another week. I'll check them and I'll give everything a taste, make sure it has the sauerkraut flavor that I'd like. Okay, so we are about 3 weeks in for our homemade sauerkraut fermenting for us. And as you may notice on the top of some of these jars, there's a little white residue here. And that's a natural forming byproduct of the process of fermentation for the sauerkraut. It's a little scum layer. So what I'm going to do is remove the lids and scrape that off. If you notice that during this process, you can do the same, and then just make sure that the weight is down and the brine covers the top layer of your sauerkraut. So let me remove the lid here, the airlock. I'll remove the weight, and there's just this white residue on the top here. So what I do is I just rinse that off. And I take a fork. If there's any pieces of that, right now it's just on this top leaf, and the remainder of this looks really good. So now I'm going to just take a paper towel. See, the top layer of the sauerkraut is nice and pristine in color and appearance. So I'll just take a paper towel and go around the side of the glass and wipe off if there's any of that little white residue on the glass. Looks good. Now that our weight's all nice and clean, I'll place that in here and press it down, just making sure that the brine comes up and covers everything again. We have a good, I'd say, 1/2 inch of brine covering all the sauerkraut. I'll put the airlock lid back on in our ring, and now we'll move to the garlic. This one has a much bigger scum layer, you can see. If you do other style fermentations using vinegar, you might recall the concept of a SCOBY being formed. It's more or less what this is. Similar type of result and consistency. Now this went down into the first layer, so I'm going to remove that top layer of sauerkraut. Smells really good. I'd say this sauerkraut will be ready to store, and if you're going to can, which I'm going to can some of it, I can't decide if I want to leave some in the refrigerator or just can it all. I'll be doing that later this week. The consistency, appearance, and the aroma of it is like a nice sauerkraut. So again, I just take the paper towel and wipe off any residue I might see on the glass. And then I'll put the weight back in and press it down. Look at all that nice brine that's coming up as I press it. I'll add the airlock and the ring. So now it's all been cleaned up again, and we have some nice looking sauerkraut that can continue to ferment if need be. But like I said, the appearance and aroma is, I think we're ready. This is going to be ready to be stored. So the fermentation process is a healthy and wonderful way to prepare cabbage to make this tangy and delicious condiment or side dish, and it works wonderful in numerous different recipes. So watch for part 2 of this video where we go over how to store our homemade sauerkraut. And you'll see 2 different methods you can use for once your homemade sauerkraut is ready to consume. If you'd like more inspiration or ideas on food preservation projects, you can check out my food preservation playlist, as well as numerous other videos I have on my channel. Well, if you're new to the channel, I would really appreciate you subscribing. And if you enjoyed this or any other videos that you watch, please give them a thumbs up. Well, I hope you're having a great day. See you next time. Take care.